All right, welcome to a Colorado real estate exam prep. And today we're going to talk about Colorado forms and contracts. We are going to dive into one section of your Colorado real estate exam. And if you're looking at this thing, 23 items. There are literally 23 questions on your Colorado real estate exam that revolve around Colorado forms and contracts out of 74 questions. This is a huge section, right? Like, as we're looking at this thing, we know that agency, contracts, and some of the law and practice are going to be the biggest things that we can look at to prepare for our Colorado real estate exam. And so we're going to dive into the Colorado forms and contracts piece. So what this is going to look like today is this. I have a couple sections where we are going to specifically look at actually some of these forms and contracts. And we're going to go over some of the high level 20,000 foot view of these with some visuals, which I think is super, super helpful. Then what we're going to do is I have two questions for each of these sections that I'll give you guys a couple, seconds. I would say minutes, but that feels like an awfully long time just for me to stare at the computer. For you guys to look at the question and see if you can come up with the answer. And then I'm going to give you the explanation for the answer. So let's jump into this thing. And we're going to kick this off with the seller's property disclosure. All right. So the SPD, the seller's property disclosure in Colorado, this is the form that the seller uses to disclose any material facts about the property. All right. And you notice I didn't say defects. This is just facts in general that they know. Like, this could be the age of the roof. It's going to go through, and yes, if there are any issues with the property, it's going to be disclosed as well. So if you're looking on the right side of the screen, like, this is actually the SPD. This is your seller's property disclosure. And we need to keep in mind this. This is not a warranty. All right. This is for disclosure when we're looking at what is going on with the seller's property for the buyer. It's going to help the buyer make some informed decisions, right? Like, they're going to go through, they're going to be able to look at what the seller is disclosing. What's important about this form is that it's not a form that is mandated for use for the seller. All right. So the seller does not need to fill this form out. Yet, just because they don't fill it out does not remove their obligation to actually disclose any material defects that they actually know. All right. So again, I just told you that this form isn't necessarily to disclose material defects. Yes, you are. There is definitely going to be material defects that are going to be disclosed on here, but it's just like any material facts actually known about the home. Yet, what we do know is this: the seller must disclose all material defects. So if they choose not to use this form, that does not remove their obligation to disclose all known material defects. And so we need to keep in mind, like, as we're looking at this thing, it's the seller's current and actual knowledge. All right. So the seller's current and actual knowledge. If they know the roof leaks, they're going to disclose, hey, the roof leaks. Because here's the thing: when does somebody realize the roof leaks? Well, maybe after we have a snow, right? We have a snowstorm come through Colorado and there's snow on the roof and then it starts to melt. You probably notice some water dripping through the home. Or if it's raining outside, you're probably going to notice some water. You're not going to notice it on a bright summer day. So this is the seller's actual and current knowledge to any material defects. As well as, if you're looking at this, if they think that there's something wrong, but they don't know, they no obligation to disclose, right? Like, if you think that there might be an issue with the foundation, you're not disclosing this information unless you actually know that there is an issue. Also, here's the thing: If something changes, let's say we go into contract day one, 15 days later, we actually realize that there is an issue. We need to update the form. Okay. So it's actual and current knowledge. And so if something were to change, we need to update the form. I also want to point this out, right? At the very bottom, you can see buyers should still conduct their own inspections and due diligence. The SPD does not replace a professional home inspection. All right. You get this in your hand, you're giving it over to your buyer. You're still going to tell your buyer, like, hey, I think it's in your best interest to have an independent home inspector to come through here and to assess the property. Just because it's not on here doesn't mean it doesn't exist. All right. So let's look at some questions. Your first question: Colorado law requires buyers to be notified of the source of water for residential properties. How does the buyer receive this notice? Well, it's not a trick question, right? You're just like, well, Charles, we're on the seller's property disclosure. So hopefully you jump to A. All right. So the contract to buy and sell gives the buyer notice to review the seller's property disclosure or the source of water addendum. So here's the thing: if your seller decides not to fill out the SPD, they say, you know what, I don't want to fill out the SPD for whatever reason. There's multiple reasons why they may or may not want to. If they do not fill out the seller's property disclosure, they have to fill out the source of water addendum. All right. So that's their only two options. You have to disclose the water, because this is the thing when we're talking about a habitable home. Well, a lender's not going to lend on a home that doesn't have water. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that there is water. We need to disclose to our client where the water is coming from. It's either going to be done with the SPD or it's going to be on the water addendum. Your second question: the purpose of the seller's property disclosure is to B, right? Create written disclosure of material facts about the property. No disclosure removes all liability, and brokers will still have to disclose any material facts that we actually know. The disclosure does not replace the need for an inspection. So, guys, like if you're getting a test question around anything around this SPD, the seller's property disclosure, and should my client still have an inspection, or if it wasn't put on there, do we have an obligation to still disclose? Yes, we do. We need to make sure that the clients and the buyers have all of the updated information. All right. We're going to see some questions around the amend extend with broker. All right. So I don't know if everyone knows this, but there's two different amend extends, right? There's an amend extend where we're attaching it to the contract to buy and sell. So that's between the buyer and the seller, right? So there's your CBS. But there's also an amend extend with the broker. And so if you're looking at this thing and you're thinking, well, this must be around the agency agreement, you're absolutely right. Okay. So when we're looking at this, we know that when we're going through, there's a couple different things that we have to keep in mind with the exclusive rights. All right. So our listing agreement, whether it's the buy side or the sell side, one of those is, let's talk about the list side. All right. So the list side, what are we doing? Well, we're actually sitting down at the dining room table with the seller, and they are telling us what the price and terms that they are willing to accept on their home, right? Like we're going through and they say, well, hey, $600,000, I'm willing to accept a conventional or an FHA loan. Okay. So we take that information after we get the signatures, and then we go through and we put the home on the MLS. The home on the MLS, right? It reads $600,000, terms, conventional or FHA. Now, what happens if there's a price decrease, right? So the seller now at this point, they've said, you know what? Hi, this home is set on the market for a little bit longer than I'm comfortable with. All right. And I think it's time that we do a price decrease, or maybe you suggest it to them. You're like, well, hey, we thought the market was going to command $600,000. And yet there's homes in the area that are selling a little bit quicker than your home. And so I advise, right? Material benefit, right? Because we have an agency agreement. And we advise them that we believe that if they drop their home X amount of dollars, their home would be seen by more people and we would get an offer. But how do we do that? We just sat down, we did an exclusive right, and the exclusive right told us $600,000. This right here is the form that you would use to do a price correction. This is the form right here that you would use if you were going to go through and extend your agency agreement. All right. This is the form that you are going to use if you are going to change anything inside of your agency agreement with either the seller and or the buyer. It's going to modify the commission structure, right? So we can modify the commission structure. Let's say that we go out and we negotiate 2.5%. But yet, as we're going through somewhere along the lines, we've deemed it necessary to maybe say, hey, you know what? We're going to be closer to like 2.8. This is where we would do this. The scope of the brokerage service, any other relationship adjustments outside of a change of relationship, right? That's its own form. We don't do agency down to transaction broker through this form. That's a change of status. That's a completely different form. But yet, everything else, when we are changing how we are going to market after it's been written in the contract, or how we're going to serve our clients, or commission, or price, or insert anything here, that's all done in the exclusive rights, the listing and the buyer agency agreement. If we're going to change anything, it is done with this form. So let's look at some questions. A seller has agreed by email to extend her listing for another 60 days. The listing broker, you should land on A. So the listing broker should have the seller sign a listing contract, amend, extend. Guys, you have an agency agreement. We know that all agency must be in writing. All right. In Colorado, our default, if it's not in writing, we are a transaction broker. All right. If you do not get an agency agreement signed, you are a transaction broker. For agency, you must have a written agreement. Well, Rule F, Colorado, we have to use Colorado commission approved forms. So the amend extend form is a Colorado commission approved form. Yes, they told us in an email, let's re-roll this thing. I love everything you're doing. I understand that my home's sitting on the market a little bit longer than we expected. How about another 2 months to get my home sold? Well, this is the form that we would do, even though it was in a email and it was in writing. We know that agency must be in writing on a Colorado commission approved form. So we're just going to do this and do a little bit more paperwork. Here's another question. The listing broker has a property under contract due to close on March 29th. The listing with the seller expires March 15th. All of the following are true about the listing and the contract, except. Now you're probably looking at this one. I'm not going to click it right away because you're probably looking at this and you're maybe having an internal dialogue with yourself. The answer is A. All right. If the contract fails after March 15th, the seller is obligated to extend the listing so the broker can get another offer. So hopefully you caught the accept piece, right? The accept piece is big. This is what they're going to throw at you on your Colorado exam. They're going to lead you down one path and then they're going to throw accept on you. They're not obligated to re-sign a contract with you, right? An agency agreement. They're not expected to do any of these things. Once the listing expires, the seller has no obligation to the listing broker. They don't have to re-sign. The seller will have to pay the listing broker if the contract does close, right? Like that will happen, yes. So they don't, on the other hand, have to re-sign the agreement. And as you're looking at this thing, it doesn't talk about money anywhere, right? So that's probably one of the important things to keep in mind when we're going through this exam. Don't insert language. This just said, okay, your agency agreement's about to end. What does the seller have to do? Nothing. They don't have to do anything. It doesn't say anything about anything in here, right? March 29th, cool. Like, but we're not going to add any more information. What we need to know is this: we have an agency agreement. It has a definite start date and a definite end date. The definite end date is rolling on up. What does our client need to do? Nothing. They don't need to do anything. So let's jump in to closing instructions. All right. And so we're looking at the Colorado closing instructions. This is a required document in all real estate transactions. All right. So this is every closing that you are a part of as a licensed real estate agent will have closing instructions that are attached to them. And just like everything else, guys, if you're looking at this top right corner, you can see that this is the Colorado Commission approved form. And just like everything else, if you are looking at these images as they're going through, I have literally just pulled all of these off of the commission's website, and I have screenshot the first page. And you can see what we also know is it has legal and tax consequences, right? We know that before we have our client sign anything, we need to let them know, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, this form has important tax and legal consequences. You might want to speak to a legal and or tax counsel prior to signing. All right. So I want to call that out. This is on all the forms. And you can see how important this is because literally both of those sections, Colorado real estate approved, right? And it goes to the mandate. So we're talking about Rule F. We're also talking like, right, how do we get to Rule F? Because of Conway Bogue. And then the second piece, as we're looking at this thing, is saying tax and legal consequences. It is so important that we say this. That is literally on every one of our forms, sometimes twice. But let's look at the Colorado closing instructions. It outlines the responsibilities of the buyer, the seller, and the closing agent. All right. The buyer, the seller, and the closing agent. Typically, the closing agent is the title company and or an attorney. And in Colorado, you do have the right to do a closing. All right. I just want to put that out there. Like, you can do a closing as a real estate agent. I don't recommend it, yet you could. So, what you do notice, though, or I guess what you don't notice, is it doesn't say agent, as in real estate agent, right? It doesn't say buyer's agent. It doesn't say listing agent. It doesn't say any of that. It says the buyer, the seller, and the closing agent. So where your head should go right now is who are the parties to this form? Well, they're the ones in bold that I said, the buyer, the seller, and the closing agent. The real estate agent, unless they are going to act as the closing agent, are not a party to this form. Again, this is something that's been approved by the Colorado Real Estate Commission and must be signed before closing. This is the playground rules, everyone. Like, this is literally, they're going through it, authorizes the closing entity, right? It's saying, hey, closing company, will you prepare and execute our closing documents? Which obviously that's important. It's going to go through and it's going to define the escrow responsibilities. It's going to say how the funds are going to be handled, right? It's going to go through all of these things. This is literally the playground rules as we are going through the closing, right? We think of a closing as 30 days, right? 30 days in time. And so as we're going through this 30-day time period, yes, it can go more, yes, it can go less, but let's just go 30. We drop off earnest money day 3 after we have an executed contract, right? Buyer, seller signatures. And day 30 is when we close. This document needs to be signed prior to closing. Again, the buyer, the seller, the closing agent. Those are the party to the contract. So let's look at some closing instruction questions. Well, here we are. Hopefully, we hit this home. The parties to the closing instructions are, seller, buyer, and the title company, right? The closing instructions are used by the seller, the buyer, to hire the title company to close the transaction. So there's only 3 parties to the agreement. All right. Now I'm going to throw this at you. And the instructions, or I'm sorry, the explanation when you see this is going to maybe allude to something else. Question number 2. The main purpose of the approved closing instructions form is to. Well, it's D. It's to allow the seller and the buyer to hire the closing company. But I do want you to look at this explanation. When we're looking at the explanation, the second use of this form is for the listing broker to hire the closing company as a scrivener to complete legal documents for the brokerage. So the listing agent goes through and they hire the closing company. Like I said, you could do the closing, but yet we don't typically do it in Colorado. We have either an attorney, not necessarily even the attorney, but most cases, most of the time, we are going to use the closing company. Yet they are preparing forms for us. They are what's called a scrivener. Now, this is what's important. Let's talk about Colorado closings for a hot second. One of the things that we need to understand in the Colorado closings section, because there's going to be a couple questions on this. And so we just looked at the closing instructions, but now we're talking about this scrivener piece. And the scrivener piece is important because of this. You are paying them to be your writer, right? That's all this is. A scrivener is the person writing. You're still responsible for the closing. All right. Just because the closing company is preparing all the documents does not take you off the hook. So when we're talking about the Colorado closings, we have to understand that you are responsible for your party. If your party gets paperwork that's wrong and they sign it, you're responsible, not the title company. You, their real estate agent. Also, I think it's very important to know that you're responsible for your party. You're not responsible for the other party. Buyer's agent responsible for the buyer. Seller's agent responsible for the seller. All right. You're not responsible for the other party. And when we're talking about Colorado closings, I think it's also important to point this out. You've had a fantastic year. All right. Congratulations. You guys got into the business and you crushed it. And you deserve a little bit of time off. You're going to go to the beach. You want to put your sand or your feet in the sand. You want to, work on your tan a little bit, maybe order some drinks. And you have a closing this week. So you reached out to one of your buddies at the brokerage and you said, "Hey, bud, will you sit on my closing for me? My clients, they're good. I've prepped them. I just need somebody there so that they know they're being taken care of." And your buddy says, "Yeah, sure. I got you. Have fun. Have fun on the beach." So going through the closing, there's some documents that are wrong. Your real estate agent buddy that sat there for you with your clients didn't notice it. Well, who's responsible? Your buddy who sat at the closing and you, the real estate agent, are responsible because it was your closing. So everyone that was attached to that deal will be responsible for a wrong closing. I want to point that out. Just because we hire a company to go through and to write, to be our scrivener, does not take us off a hook. Just like contracts, right? Like we know this. Just because they are a Colorado real estate approved form, if we use a third party platform, like we all do, right? We all use a third party platform. You're not going through and writing contracts verbatim off of the Colorado contract. No, you're downloading it from a server, from a platform somewhere. Well, if any of that's wrong, you're responsible. The third party platform that you paid for and you chose to use, they're not responsible. So again, like as we're talking about Colorado contracts and forms, if you get a test question, right, where they're going through and they're talking about who's responsible if this is wrong or if rules have changed, because they're constantly changing, we're constantly updating contracts. You, the real estate broker, are responsible, not the third party platform that you chose to purchase it from. It's talking about counter proposals. All right, so this is a counter proposal. I don't know if anyone's ever seen this before, right? We talk about counter proposals, but I don't know if this is what you envisioned. But this is the counter proposal. This is the first page. And so you can look at this thing. This is the official document where when a seller or a buyer wants to modify the terms of the initial CBS, the contract to buy and sell, without just full on rejecting it. All right. So instead of just saying, hey, I'm not interested, hound sand, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, this is how they say, well, there's just a couple things that I wasn't super excited about. Let's see if we can come to the table if we get these corrected. And so this is truly what it looks like. You guys can see this. It has the date. It has, the original contract, who the parties to the contract are. The address is on here, not the legal description. It has the address. And as we're looking through this, we can see date or deadline, no change or deleted, right? We could actually go through and say, hey, I'm not going to give you that contingency, right? What we are looking at on this date and deadlines are contingencies. On your exam, that's what they're going to call them. Contingent. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I intend on buying your home contingent on one of these things happening, to my sole and subjective discretion on me approving it as the buyer. So when we're looking at this, it's going through and it's saying like, hey, we want to change this date. Maybe we want to change the price. Maybe we want to add something, right? Like we're going through and we noticed that they didn't include the washer and dryer, but we didn't want to bring the washer and dryer with us, so we're adding it to the contract. Or maybe they did say, we want the refrigerator, but we're not giving the refrigerator. So this is where we would go through and remove the refrigerator. So this form is approved by the Colorado Real Estate Commission. As you guys can see, like all of the contracts questions, all of them that we use are approved by the Colorado Real Estate Commission. Once signed by the countering party, the other original offer is now void, right? So we know this. When we counter, we are voiding the original offer. We can't go back to it. I mean, there's no real revive button on this, okay? This is an automatic rejection and void of the original offer. So this thing can go back and forth numerous times, right? So we're really just making small changes. This is not to rewrite a whole contract. If we were going to go through and rewrite the whole contract, right, there's just so many things wrong, then we're not going to use this form. This form is for minor changes. Maybe a couple dates don't make sense. The price maybe doesn't make sense. Earnest money maybe doesn't make sense. So this is the form that gets used. And so we just have to keep in mind, like, as we are using this, it voids the original offer. And if we counter a counter, which that gets messy, but can still be done, the counter previously is now voided as well. Keep in mind, we got offer, we have offerer, and we have offeree, and whoever is sending this counter is now the offerer. And the receiver, it could be the buyer, is now the offeree. So let's look at this thing. So let's look at a question. So we got, when the seller uses the approved counter proposal form, the seller's signature is the only one is going to be on the counter proposal form. If the buyer accepts the counter, then the buyer will sign it and the contract will be created. The seller never signs the offer. Okay, guys, I need you to know this. If the seller signs the offer, we now have offer and acceptance. The original offer comes in, and if the seller signs that original offer, we have offer and acceptance, even if they intended to counter it. So you only sign the form that you accept. So as you're going through and you're countering, you're only going to sign the counter as either the buyer or the seller, and you're going to send it off. And if the other party agrees, then they sign, and now we have offer and acceptance. The counter and the broker's signature are on the contract are not a part of the agreement, but the acknowledgement. All right. So, guys, as real estate agents, you're not a party to the contract. There's there is a small section to where you are. It's around the compensation. Yet, with that being said, you are not a party to the contract. Yes, you're going to sign the original offer, the original contract to buy and sell, the CBS, but that does not mean offer and acceptance. It's just an acknowledgement because we're acknowledging on this. The acknowledgement is truly around the compensation, right? That hey, the compensation is X amount of dollars, and so that's where we're going through acknowledgement and compensation disclosures. The seller has given the buyer a counter proposal, which the listing broker attached to the contract to buy and sell and sent to the buyer's broker and buyer. This means what? Well, this means the original offer is terminated, but terms not changed in the counter are still a part of the original offer. All right, so check this out, guys. When we're going through, we're only changing the things that we want to counter. We don't need to counter everything. So the counter proposal is just going to lay out the things that we need changed. If it was not addressed in the counter proposal, that means the original offer that came through, we are still operating on those terms. All right. So, like, as we're going through and we're looking at this, that's very important. The counter does not change the entire contract, it attaches to the contract. And now we have some new terms that we weren't excited about in the original offer, but all the stuff that we did not touch still remains in play. All right. Omitted as inapplicable. So I did enlarge a contract, and this is a real contract that I had, and I threw this arrow for you guys to see this. I think this is a little bit harder to maybe grasp this, and so hopefully this visual actually helps. All right. So as we're looking at this thing on the right hand side, this is what I want to point out. You're going to have verbiage in contracts, and this is the contract to buy and sell. All right. So this is the CBS. This is the contract to buy and sell. The parties are the buyer and the seller. Well, there's going to be some verbiage that don't touch every deal, like an assumption, right? So let's talk about an assumption, right? So an assumption is where the buyer is going to take over the seller's loan. That's what an assumption is. Well, in all reality, those deals are going to be few and far between. But yet, we do have the ability to do them. And instead of creating a new contract to buy and sell, the commission has just put that section in our contract to buy and sell because it's loan terms, right? It's just a set of loan terms. But you can see that we actually have this ability to remove that section, and it doesn't completely erase it. And what it does is it just says, like, hey, there was a section around assumptions. There was also a section around seller or private financing, which also few and far between. And we have omitted them. That's what this looks like. All right. So you as a real estate agent on a Colorado Commission approved form have this phrase that will pop up. So on our contract, we actually check, we have a checkbox. We check the checkbox and it says we're omitting it. And then it actually has to show that it was omitted to the buyer and the seller. And this is how it shows up. All right. It just means it's not relevant to this specific transaction. Now, what I want you to know is this isn't available on everything. All right. This is on a small handful of provisions as well as some other components of a form. All right. And so as we're looking at this, like you can't go through and delete the normal like good funds, right? You see like form of funds. And on the top here it says form of funds, time of payment, and available funds. Well, you as the real estate agent don't have the ability to omit that section. All right. You don't have the ability to cross out any of that information. That would be the illegal practice of law. A lawyer could do it. The general public could do it, but you as a real estate agent, you don't have any power to do that. So let's look at this. Let's look at a question. A broker is preparing a counter proposal for the seller where the only item being countered is the price. The broker, all right. So you're looking at this thing, and I snuck in a counter proposal, right? So we just talked about the counter proposal, and now we're talking about omitted as applicable. So as we're looking at this thing, it's you can actually omit the dates and deadlines table. All right, you're saying, hey, we're removing these because we're not touching them. The counter allows for the table to be omitted if dates are not being changed. If the table is left and the dates are blank, then they're just going to carry over. Now, if we were to go a little bit further and we were to put NA or deleted, those means those dates don't exist anymore. That contingency, remember we talked about the counter proposal, we can actually say, hey, we're removing this contingency. Here's an example where that would show up because I think this gets a little bit hard to maybe visualize this. So let's go back and I'm actually going to pull this up. Let's look at the counter proposal. All right. So this is what I was just talking about. You can actually see that this table may be omitted. Like it actually says that right above the table. If I'm looking at this and maybe we're going through and what I have is seller's property disclosure. Okay. So that's a contingency that the seller will provide the seller's property disclosure. Well, maybe your seller, you got this offer, right? You got the contract to buy and sell. You are the seller's agent. And the offer came through, and your seller said, no, I don't want to give a seller's property disclosure. I have no problem listing all the material defects in the home, and we can send that over, but I am not going to give an SPD. So you receive this offer from a buyer, you would actually counter. You love everything. Your client loves everything else except they are not given SPD. So what you would do is you would mark deleted and it would delete that contingency. Everything else would stay in play. You fire it over to your client or to the buyer's agent. And then if the buyer agent accepts it and their client accepts it, it's signed. And now we're going forward. Also, right, because we're talking about omitted, if there's no changes in the counter, maybe you're just going to counter the price. You didn't like the price. You would check this box. This is omitted. And there would be no change to any dates and deadlines. And then the only thing that's being countered is the price. So I hope hopefully that was helpful. All right. Your second question. A listing broker has deleted the holdover clause and inserted language in the additional provisions which states upon termination of this listing, if the property is sold within 90 days, the broker shall receive a full commission. This language is. Well, it's unacceptable. And it is a violation of the commission rules. All right, guys, again, for the most part, It's really about financing. When we're talking about the contracts, it's more of the financing. I think if you go into your exam and you really just think about like financing as what could be omitted as inapplicable, then I think you're going to be safe. If you go through, you do not have the ability to redline a contract, right? You don't have the ability to say, you know what, I actually don't like this. No, you're not a lawyer. You have the right to practice limited law because of Conway Bogue. Conway Bogue says because of Rule F, you can do fill in the blank contracts. That does not give you the right to go through and cross certain provisions out that you do not like. That would be the illegal practice of law. You would probably actually lose your license depending on how severe this was. So, as you're going through and we're doing this, since there is language, there is already a clause, the holdover clause is already there. You can't say, I don't like this one. I'm going to put my own in. Brokers can't remove the holdover period, right? They can't put any open ended obligation to pay a commission. You just can't. So, what this is actually pointing to, right, says if the property is sold within 90 days, the broker shall receive a commission, right? This isn't saying who sold it. So that's also another red flag. But just for the purpose of understanding this omitted piece, you can't go through and just cross off language that you don't want in there. If it's already there, you have to use it. That's part of Rule F because of Conway Bogue. Now, again, you have the ability to go through what we do know because of Conway Bogue. We have the ability to put some language in, right? And as we're looking at the contracts, what we do know is that different font, it's going to be in a different color. To where we're going through and we're printing off this and it's clearly differentiated. And they understand when we are filling out pieces versus what has already been a part of the pre-printed forms that have been approved. Now, again, you can't just go through and blanket these, right? So I want you to know this. When you go into the exam, if you do get a test question around this, which I think you might, you don't get to say, this is how I always do deals, Mr. or Mrs. Seller, sign here. I put this provision in. The buyer, the seller, have to go through and approve anything that you write. And so you can't just go through and say, here's just how I do business. Here are 3 provisions that I do every deal, sign off on it. No, it has to be through a discussion. They have to agree to it, just like the sell price and everything else. You are not in the driver's seat. You are an agent. You have fiduciary responsibility. That fiduciary responsibility is to your client, not yourself, not your brokerage. It is to your client. So, as we're going through with the additional provisions, yes, you can put information in there. You can write different things. You can do it, but it has to be approved by your client. And it can't be to change a language that's already there, especially for your benefit.